Hello there, and thanks for joining us for this next episode in MMTed Q&A. Thanks to all of those who have submitted questions for us to answer. There's been many, and we'll do our best to get through them all. Tonight I have a special guest to help me work through them, but first a few simple questions. From Samuel. Hello Samuel. Samuel wondered if the MMT discussions will be restricted only to YouTube, and he suggests maybe we explore making them available on Spotify. We're more than happy to do that. We're looking at ways to disseminate our information more broadly, and we'll look into that. Thanks, Samuel. And then there was a simple question from Somjit, and excuse me if I've mispronounced your name. Somjit asked, I want to read in detail about the issues discussed by Fidel Kabub. Some journal articles or books would be great help. Now, he's obviously referring to last week's Q&A, where we had Fidel Kabub as our guest. Here's his contact details, and so you can see his email on there, and I'm sure if you send Fidel a nice email and ask for some further information, he'd be more than happy to help you. Now, tonight we're going to go through 4 questions, and I invited my colleague, MMT colleague, Professor Randall Wray from Bard College in the US to join me. And we've been long-time colleagues, good friends, and sometime co-author. And the question that we started with tonight was from Andrea. And Andrea was wondering what the epistemological validity of MMT was or is compared to mainstream macroeconomics. And he wants to know, where does MMT fit in the philosophy of science? So after some introductory discussion with Randy, I put the question to him, and this is what he had to say.
It's also the way that we analyze MMT too. We see it as a paradigm, and we see MMT as a paradigm shift. I think a lot of the pieces for MMT were already there. And all of the people who helped create MMT brought with them a lot of ideas from other traditions, from Keynes, from Marx, from the institutionalists, and integrated all of those into a new paradigm. And so just to back up, the Kuhn's theory was that all scientists have to have a paradigm. You can't even come up with questions without a paradigm, much less try to answer the questions. So we all operate with paradigm works. And since we're talking about economics, we're talking about the economic world, how the economy works. And the mainstream paradigm, and we can keep this really simple, is basically the market view, that the invisible hand guides us to make the correct decisions. And Keynes reacted against that view. There was a Keynesian revolution in the scientific sense of the term. Keynes had a completely different paradigm, a different worldview, and many people wrote about the Keynesian revolution. Unfortunately, it did not take. And this is really a puzzle for those of us who follow Kuhn, because if you think of moving from the view the earth is flat to moving to the view that the earth is round, that completely changes the way that you view the earth. Moving from the view that the earth is the center of the universe to the view that the earth goes around the sun is a completely different view. And normally with scientific revolutions, you don't go back to the old one. Okay? We don't go back. I know there are some flat earthers, but we look at them as being completely insane. But in economics, the majority of the profession did go backwards. They went back to the old views that Keynes had thoroughly discredited. And so it's a puzzle that that revolution didn't take. And I know the questioner is wondering whether the MMT revolution will take, because it is providing a new view. Of course, we think it's correct. It fits the facts as we know them much better than the mainstream view does. And normally in science, that is what wins out. Now, I think Kuhn's theory applies very well to the natural sciences, maybe not quite so well to the social sciences. And it's possible that we won't win out, but I think that we are making progress, and we've seen that when this global pandemic hit, which became a global economic crisis hit, that many policymakers who had previously been describing MMT as completely insane have now embraced what they think MMT is. They don't really get it right, but the point is that they have realized the paradigm they were using was completely wrong, and they're looking for something new.
Yeah, so when I studied philosophy of science, I became quite interested in the next iteration of Kuhn. That was from Imre Lakatos, and he expanded it into some of the and trying to answer some of those questions. He talked about degenerative paradigms, and this was a paradigm that it was still dominant, and we can think of that as mainstream economics, but had lost what he called empirical content. And in other words, it was unable to explain anything that was of interest. And you know, that's why I often use Japan as an example of the inability of, because you know I'm interested in data and econometrics and things like that. And Japan has sort of pushed the policy parameters much more than other advanced countries. They've had larger deficits for longer, larger public debt for longer. And so there, you know, I often think of that's a good, not, you know, whatever you want to call it, a test case for the mainstream propositions to see whether they have got empirical content. And of course they haven't. They can't explain why interest rates are zero and why yields are now negative on long-term debt and why there hasn't been any inflation in Japan. And in that context, I think that MMT has got empirical content. So in the Lakatosian sense, I think that we have got credentials to be an emerging and replacement paradigm.
And then speaking of degenerative science, the most advanced of the orthodox economics doesn't even look at the real world at all. They don't even try to explain any real world phenomenon. They are doing the equivalent of angels on pinheads. That's all they do. They never touch base with the real world. Now, as a policy maker, of course, you have to come down and touch base with the real world. And so they use a very simple version of the mainstream theory to try to analyze it. As you say, they get it all wrong, completely wrong.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is when you think about, say, the new Keynesian macro paradigm, which is sort of the orthodoxy, you know, one of the ways they usurped whatever we call the Keynesian sort of consensus in the 60s was to say that, well, Keynes, the notions of Keynes were built on the assumption that humans were irrational. And of course, you know, money illusion, all of that stuff. And of course, humans aren't irrational because a priori the mainstream claim they're not. And so there's all that micro foundations literature that, now the problem, you know, when you take that into the new Keynesian era, they make a big thing of being micro founded. In other words, they believe that it's some sort of scientific credibility that that they're basing their extrapolations and their predictions on the basis of what they call grounded human behaviour, rationality and things, maximisation, which none of the social psychologists or sociologists would buy anyway, but that's a separate story. But of course, when they run their econometric models, those simple propositions that they use to derive their mathematical results can't generate a statistical model that has any relationship with the data. And so then they, from an econometric point of view, they then fudge that and add a few extra variables. And as soon as they do that, they've lost any pretension to be micro-founded, because the models they come out to try to fit the data with can't be derived from their micro principles. And I've always been amused by why they don't see that.
It's ad hoc.
Ad hoc's the word. So, Andrea, I hope that answers your question. Both Randy and I are confident that MMT is a viable paradigm, a viable lens, as I call it, a framework for understanding, and we'll see what the future holds. So, Randy, the second question was from, and it's quite a different question altogether. It's from Enrico, and he asks, would you necessarily need to raise taxes to implement Medicare for all? Could abolishing the income tax be feasible if you offset it with another tax? So this is an American-centric question, and you know more about that than I do.
Yeah, so I guess first we better describe what Medicare for All is. Medicare for All would be a health system much more like what every other rich developed country has, where you provide health care to everybody. And essentially it's public spending. We don't have that in the US except for people over age 65. So that is our Medicare program. And the proposal, which was pushed by Bernie Sanders and others, progressives, is to extend that to everybody so that everyone would get what seniors in the US now get, which is publicly funded healthcare.
So just so that the international audience can understand, Joe Biden doesn't support that, does he?
He has not. He has been supporting private insurance.
Right.
So most Americans have to pay for private health insurance. If they're employed, their employer typically pays about half. But it's very expensive, very inefficient, and it leaves, I think, still we had 30, 40 million people with no coverage at all, which means they have to pay out of their pocket, and they can be turned away from doctors and hospitals and so on.
Okay.
So anyway, extending it to everyone. And so would we have to increase taxes? The way to look at this from the MMT perspective is that taxes don't pay for programs. If we provided Medicare for all, would that increase resource demand so much that we need to reduce resource demand somewhere else to avoid inflation pressure? So it's a question about whether we have the resource capability to provide healthcare to everyone in the United States.
And so what do we actually mean by resource capability?
Yeah, well, I don't mean money. I mean the real doctors, hospitals, medicine, ambulances, all of that kind of stuff. And if you compare the US use of real resources, not money, real resources, we use about twice as many resources as the next closest rich country does. And we're close to 20% of GDP. Most rich countries are around 10%. Japan, I think, is about 8%. And we have the worst outcome of any country.
That's right.
We spend twice as much and we get worse results. So, and a big part of that is because of the private health insurance system. That is a big part of our inefficiency. So in other words, if we went to Medicare for all, we probably would reduce total resource use by a very conservative estimate saving would be about 3%. Say a longer term view getting us more like every other rich country means we would save about 10% of GDP. So it's somewhere between 3 and 10. That means we're going to be releasing resources, not demanding more resources. We actually, moving to Medicare for all, we might find that resources are becoming unemployed because we're saving so many resources by moving to a more efficient system. And if that's true, the answer is no, you cut taxes, you don't raise taxes as you implement. Now, the transition can be difficult. Some of the resources you release, people who work in the private health insurance sector are not going to be well trained to move into a publicly provided healthcare system. And so they may need retraining and so on. So I think that the 10% number is probably way too high. The 3% savings number is probably about right. I don't see any scenario in which we're going to need to raise taxes to release more resources than we already will be releasing as we move to Medicare for all.
So why don't the deficit hawks see that?
Well, I mean, they are focused on dollars. They're focused on the money that is being spent. And they make some of them, I mean, it's such a simple mistake. You would think that they would catch it, but they don't catch it. They just add on the estimated cost of Medicare for all to the system we already have. So they say, we're already at 20%. We add Medicare for all, we're going to go to 25, 27, 28% of GDP, which of course makes no sense whatsoever. We're going to be saving resources, not adding on Medicare for all to what we already have. That would be crazy. We're not going to do it. Given a choice, everyone will eventually dump their private insurance. Everyone will. Bernie wanted to make it mandatory, get rid of the private health insurance, and there were political reasons for that. But given a choice, everyone will do it eventually. I mean, it may take a year, it may take 2 years, but they will see the advantages of doing it. So anyway, that's one of the reasons. And then the other is just, okay, under the current system, private firms and households pay about 1/3 of the cost. And so we will be shifting more spending to the federal government. And so the deficit hawks are just purely looking at the federal government's budget and more spending without raising taxes. Now, for reasons we could talk about with respect to one of the other questions, it's very hard to predict what will happen to the deficit. Okay, but they automatically assume the deficit will get bigger. That may not be true at all because the deficit outcome is, we say, endogenous to the economy. It's impossible to really predict what will happen to total government spending and total tax revenue once we have this kind of a reform. It's such a huge reform to our whole economy.
Yeah.
But that's what they focus on. And that's
so what about the issue then if the private expenditure that's currently tied up in these rent-seeking arrangements from insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies and all the rest of it that sort of inflating the overall healthcare expenditure, it may well be that the federal government's the total outlay doesn't fall, but federal government spending goes up in net terms. Might be, you don't know. But what about the savings of the diversion of health spending on private sector to other things? Wouldn't that be an issue?
Well, so first, if you compare the United States, so as I said, we spend about twice as much. And maybe half of that is because we spend more for the same services.
Yeah.
So we spend much more for the drugs, pharmaceuticals. We spend much more on the doctors. And there are complicated reasons for this. For example, doctors in the United States have very high malpractice insurance because they're sort of little for-profit firms, and they're afraid of being sued. Other countries don't have that. So our doctors have to make a lot more money because they have to pay these high insurance rates. So we have lots of inefficiencies built into the system that are inflationary. Okay, because we spend so much more, our drugs and healthcare costs are increasing very rapidly. So we have inflation pressure from that. And we will be reducing the prices of all of that stuff and reducing the rate of increase of those prices. And yes, people might be spending more in other places. I expect that firms, when they don't have to pay such high health insurance costs for their employees, might give workers better other kinds of benefits, maybe more vacation time, paid vacation. You know, we have no law that mandates paid vacation in the United States at all.
Right.
And a lot of workers don't get any at all. So if employers didn't have to spend so much on health insurance, we might have some paid vacation time. Right. So on net, I don't believe that we're going to get inflation from that extra spending, but I think we will have better lives.
So Enrico, I hope that answers your question, and it's a really interesting segue, I think, into the next question from Rory. And this is was a complex question, but basically he's really concerned about the political flexibility in the realm of taxes and spending. He posits that MMT believes that you can adjust net spending, in other words, spending and taxation at the federal level, within relation to so-called inflationary limits. And he's wondering whether if you did have an inflationary episode, then that would imply that governments would need to be able to quickly raise taxes or curtail spending to curtail those pressures. So his question really is, what's the practicality of that? And wouldn't it be better just to allow the predictable annual expenditure to be close to tax levels, which he says would not be drastically different to systems in place in many countries today? So it's really about how to deal with rent seekers and the whole political thing. What have you got to say about that, do you reckon?
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of issues there. So first, what MMT advocates is relying on automatic stabilizers rather than relying on discretionary tax hikes when inflation occurs or tax reductions. So, and there also was a question, maybe it was the previous one and we didn't do it, on the income tax, whether we can replace the income tax with another kind of tax.
Yeah, that's right.
So let me just say one good thing about the income tax. One good thing about the income tax is that it's pro-cyclical. So when incomes are booming, the tax rates go up with a progressive income tax. And the total tax revenue, which is withdrawing demand out of the economy, goes up. In the United States, it's really incredible how fast federal tax revenue grows.
But can I just clarify one thing there? When you say it's pro-cyclical, that means it moves with the state of the economy, but the tax rates don't change. It's just that the revenue changes. That's the point. It's not the tax rates that are pro-cyclical, it's the revenue take that's pro-cyclical.
Yes.
Yeah.
So tax revenue goes up for two reasons. One is if they're taking 20% of your income and your income goes up, you're still paying 20% on the higher amount. But also you get pushed up into higher tax brackets.
Yeah.
So progressive tax, maybe your tax rate goes from 20 to 25%. And in the US, this is very important, especially at the higher income levels, where income in a boom really, really booms.
Yeah.
Bonuses the high income people get, our tax rates will grow at an annual pace of about 20% per year. Think about how fast tax revenue is growing in a boom. And on the other hand, in a recession and the coronavirus pandemic, when it hit, tax revenue just disappears. And so our tax system is already extremely cyclical. It takes out demand in a boom and it takes less out in a slump. So it already does what you want it to do. Now, mostly we rely on the spending side, MMT, the MMT proposal for a job guarantee. So that also acts, this time it's countercyclical. In bad times, you spend more on the job guarantee. In good times, you spend less. So that makes spending also very countercyclical. And you add those two things together, and you really don't have to worry about what the questioner is worrying about. That in a boom, you're going to get too much demand and it's going to cause inflation. If you have an income tax, especially a progressive one, and you have a job guarantee, you're going to put in and take out demand exactly like you would want to do, and you don't have to rely on the political will to do the right thing quick enough.
So are you suggesting that there's never a reason for the government to take a discretionary fiscal contraction, in other words, cut spending or increase taxes when there's an inflationary episode?
I would say in normal times, no. Now, if you're going to a major war, World War II, or you're going to implement a full-scale Green New Deal, which is very, in terms of spending, a very similar sort of impact on the economy, you need to plan ahead. So I'm not against planning, and so we advocate, as we implement the Green New Deal, it may be necessary to impose a tax to take some demand out. We actually prefer postponed consumption. So we're going to give it back to you. We're going to put a temporary surcharge on wages in order to reduce demand during the phase in of the Green New Deal, and then we're going to give it back to you in the form of maybe better benefits, better retirement, and so on later as the economy is ramped up. So no, I'm not saying you never want to do it. The coronavirus is a very good example of a time when we needed to ramp up fiscal stimulus. We haven't done nearly enough. But also you have to remember, we don't have a job guarantee. So we're not in any sense prepared for dealing with massive job loss. And in the United States, most people lose their jobs, don't even get unemployment compensation. So in the United States, it requires an act of Congress to deal with a downturn, which is crazy. It's a crazy way to run your economy, where you have to have an act of Congress, you have to get Republicans and Democrats together to deal with something that could be dealt with if you had in place a job guarantee. It would be automatic.
I mean, I've often argued that recurrent spending, that's spending on things that are the services that are exhausted within 12 months, they're difficult for governments to adjust quickly because they're pensions and schools and pencils and, you know, all the things that really have a high visibility in a political sense and also impact very directly on our daily lives. But that capital spendings where typically where austerity is imposed because politically they can get away with it without the people seeing that the bridges are decaying. But I've often thought that in a progressive planning, forward-thinking type environment, and the Japanese have done this historically, that you have a range of the jargon is these shovel-ready projects. You have a range of projects that are modular. They're capital public infrastructure projects that are modular, that can be that are all designed and planned with current technology, etc., but can be switched on or off relatively quickly if you need to adjust spending. And those sort of projects have very little political consequences in the short run anyway. So that's the way I've always thought about the ability to get around those type of constraints if you need to.
Yep. And if you have the job guarantee in place, then you can set some number. When employment in the job guarantee program increases above 15 million, that's the time you need some major public infrastructure to pull some of those workers out.
Now, there were some other questions relating to inflation, but I think we'll deal with them another day. The last question, and this is a US-centric question too, but I think it's relevant to everywhere, and this is from Fabio, and he asked, when a government's annual budget gets approved by Congress, so it's US Congress, I guess he's referring to, is it legally mandated that the deficit gets covered by the issuance of interest-bearing Treasury notes? And so really he's wondering about whether it's an administrative issue or a political issue, or whether it's somehow embedded in your constitution or however.
Okay, let me say yes and no. Okay, because when the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, was created in 1913, there were some provisions put in the Federal Reserve Act. And one of the provisions is that the Fed is not allowed to directly buy bonds from the Treasury or provide overdrafts.
So that's a piece of legislation though, isn't it?
It's a law.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve Act, which has been amended many times and has been, even that part has been amended at some point. During wars, it's been very typical where this provision is set aside, and the Fed is directed to function to allow the Treasury to spend without going to bond markets. And so that periodically this is suspended. But in normal times, the Treasury needs to get positive credits to its deposit account at the Fed. It's a very silly thing, but it is in the Federal Reserve Act. It can be changed at any point by Congress. Congress could say, that's a silly idea. Why not just credit the Treasury's account and let them go forward with spending? But right now, the Treasury needs to get funds into its account. Beyond some very small limit, the Treasury needs to sell bonds in the issue market. And then it can transfer funds from a private bank to the Fed. And then it can write the check. I mean, most payments are electronic now, not with physically issuing checks. But anyway, the Fed can turn around and immediately repurchase all of those bonds. So ultimately they end up on the Fed's balance sheet anyway.
So they repurchase them in the secondary bond market though?
They buy them in the secondary bond market. So first they sell it to a private bank and then the Fed buys it.
Yeah.
You could skip the private banks altogether. You could sell them directly to the Treasury, to the Fed, or you could just say, just allow overdrafts. Okay, I mean, any of those options would eliminate the middleman, which is the special dealer banks. And all of this is completely within the purview of Congress to do any time that it wants to.
And the thing that most people don't understand, and I often get asked this question, is that little piece of gymnastics between the primary issue to the authorised dealers and then the QE, whatever you want to call it, where the Federal Reserve Bank or the central bank in the general sense buys in the secondary bond market, delivers an instant capital gain to the original holders anyway. So it's sort of like it's a double whammy really. It's both unnecessary but a little bit of extra corporate welfare out there.
And this is why the people who worry, oh, what if the bond markets won't buy the bonds? That's never going to happen because the special dealer banks want to be in these markets, okay, for the reasons that you just explained. They want to be in the markets, and to remain remain a dealer bank, they must always place bids.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah,
and
we dealt with
no chance whatsoever that the bonds are not going to sell.
We dealt with that in the episode 1 last week, where I talked a bit about bid to cover ratios and the volume of bids in the primary issue relative to how much is being asked by the government. And doomsayers are always saying, oh, the bid collapsed down well below 1, which would mean there wouldn't be enough people wanting to buy the issue. And of course, the empirics are exactly the opposite, and they're rising at the moment again. Okay, well, thanks, Randy, for your time, and hope that our questionnaires, Andrea, Enrico, and Rory, and Fabio, were satisfied. And thanks very much, Randy. Take care.
Okay, thanks.
Well, that's Randy Wray, Professor Randy Wray. I hope you found that interesting. And many thanks to Randy for giving up his time. Randy will be back probably in September offering some courses in MMTed. So look out for that. We'll be announcing that fairly soon. So that's for another week. Next week I'll have another guest and some more questions. If you can help us, we only exist through donations. The program that we're building and the infrastructure and the capacity is not cheap. It's fairly labour intensive, and we really can only expand the scale if we get further financial support. We thank all of those so far that have given us some financial assistance, and we need more if you can help. Please help if you can. So that's it, and good night, and we'll see you next week.